Hi there, IB History Year 1 students. We're beginning a new unit, and this would be then our third unit of the year. And it's a sort of a transition unit between two big ones, between Unit 2, which is the French Revolution and Napoleon, a true IB unit, and then the fourth one, which is the First World War, another true IB unit. But it's hard to imagine leaping from 1815 and the defeat of Napoleon to 1914 and the First World War, or even the late 19th century and the events that sort of set the stage for the First World War, without talking a little bit about the massive transition that Europe went through in the intervening years during that long 19th century, or the role that regular people played in that transition, or the consternation and problems that the people played for their leaders, for their rulers during that time. And so that's what this unit is about. It's a sort of a connective tissue between the defeat of Napoleon and the events surrounding the outbreak, or the events, if you prefer, that set the stage for the outbreak of the First World War. I'm calling this unit Unit 3 Industrialization, Urbanization, and Nationalism. However, when I taught AP European History, I had a portion of this unit, not quite the entire unit, but I had a portion of this unit that I called the masses, unleashed and restrained. And I thought that was very clever. Um, but I'll tell you why I called it that. You need to think about how the common people had played such a huge role in the French Revolution, and then had played such a huge role in Napoleon's conquest of Europe. You know, um, there had never been a mass movement in politics like the French Revolution. I suppose that the Protestant Reformation and some of the wars that grew out of it had some of that quality. But the Protestant Reformation did not overthrow a king, did not overthrow, indeed, an entire system of government the way that the French Revolution did. And on the one hand, it's certainly true that the leaders of the French Revolution tended to be elites of one form or another, particularly the wealthy bourgeoisie of the Third Estate. They may have formed the leadership group of the French Revolution, both during its more moderate beginnings with the National Assembly and as it evolved through its more radical period under the Jacobins. Yes, the leaders may have been the elites, but they mobilized the masses in a way that no political movement really had prior to that time to achieve bigger changes than any political movement ever had. And indeed, we saw how the masses weren't simply mobilized and manipulated by the elites, but even the elites found themselves forced to shape their own policies based upon the demands of the masses. So the people, the masses, had played a huge role in the French Revolution, an unprecedented role in the French Revolution. And then the same was true of Napoleon's wars, which had their grounding in the French Revolution, in the levée en masse. And we talked about how the Prussian military thinker Karl von Clausewitz had said that wars are always conditioned by the political objectives for which they are being fought. And if you're fighting for a political objective that is seen by the nation as being something in which they had a great stake, something that was extremely important to them, then they would accept all kinds of intrusions into their lives, much higher level of sacrifice, and you could essentially mobilize an entire nation to fight what's called a total war against your enemies. That's what the French revolutionary government had done. They had mobilized the entire nation. not just simply an elite group of professional military and a sort of class of military elites, the way that war had been in the 18th century for the most part, um, but rather the whole nation was involved in the war effort. The masses had united to defend France and its revolutionary government. And then that had been the base of Napoleon's great armies, with which he swept across Europe in those sort of breathtaking first few years of his reign as emperor. And so the masses had played this really astonishingly important role during the French Revolution and Napoleon's wars. When Napoleon was defeated, the monarchs of Europe, or at least their representatives, because very few monarchs actually attended this conference, but the representatives of the monarchs of Europe gathered at Vienna, um, basically to try to figure out what the heck had happened to them, and and to sort of recover from the shock of, in the most immediate sense, Napoleon's wars. The 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 countries that gathered at Vienna for what was called the Congress of Vienna, um, were the countries that had united to defeat Napoleon. So yes, their main purpose there was to discuss what the future of Europe would look like now that Napoleon had been defeated. But they were really there to more generally turn back the clock. Um, you think about the way that things had been prior to 1789, prior to the French Revolution. Monarchs had felt secure. They never imagined that there could be a mass political movement like the French Revolution because nothing like it had ever happened before. They never imagined the possibility that they might lose their thrones or even lose their heads, in a eruption of violence originating with their sort of their peasant classes, their regular people. Um, but the French Revolution, of course, had proved that that was not only possible, but a real danger for every monarch in Europe, potentially. And then, of course, they had sort of, slowly united to try to defeat and overthrow the French Revolution. And they all kind of probably sort of breathed a sigh of relief when the French Revolution seemed to come to an end and Napoleon had taken over, only to have Napoleon then bring the French Revolution to them at the point of a gun, or perhaps at the point of a bayonet, and sort of cram it down their throats. So the 24 years, or the 26 years in between 1789, when the French Revolution had broken out, and 1815, when Napoleon was finally defeated, had been a pretty scary 26 years for the monarchs of Europe. Their certainty about power, their certainty about their ability to hold on to power had been shaken, and they had been terrified by what had happened and the prospect that it might happen to them. They wanted to be sure that no convulsion like the French Revolution and Napoleon could ever threaten them again. And so they wanted to turn back the clock to the way things were prior to the French Revolution, to a time when they, that is, monarchs, felt safe and secure, a time characterized by stability, a time in which you didn't have to be afraid of the masses, the people. What's interesting about that is that prior to the French Revolution, wars were not fought for the survival of governments. The survival of governments was never at stake in wars. When monarchies fought against each other in Europe during the 18th century, what was at stake was territory, a possession of a certain amount of territory. If you fought a war against another country, as a king, you weren't afraid that defeat was going to result in the overthrow of your government. Uh, at worst, you were going to lose a chunk of land, and and so kings, weren't terrified of war. Maybe that's why there were so many of them in the 18th century. And and also kings sort of they regarded each other um, as each other's greatest enemy. Um, but what the French Revolution had proved was that kings were not king's greatest enemy. Other kings were not king's greatest enemy. Their own people was their greatest enemy, or at least their greatest threat. The greatest threat to the survival of a monarchy was not other monarchs, it was the people themselves. And so at Vienna, one of the things that the monarchs, or rather their representatives, were determined to do was to figure out how to suppress the people and suppress their political power and suppress their military power that they had proved to have now. This was a different attitude amongst the monarchs of Europe. They had been shocked into a whole new approach, whereas the previous century had been marked by these sort of constant squabbling and constant fighting and making war on each other to grab these little chunks of territory. At least the first half of the 19th century would be marked by a sense of unity between the monarchs, a conservative unity, a conservative equilibrium, in which the monarchs said to themselves, we cannot afford to fight with each other over territory. We need to unite ourselves around the idea that we must suppress the people. We must suppress the potential for a mass movement among the people like the French Revolution was. That's what we have to be working on, and we have to work together on this. And so what happened, what followed after the Congress of Vienna was called the Concert of Europe. Um, and it's a very, that phrase looks at European history from a very elite perspective. The Concert of Europe. In a concert, you have people in a vocal concert, a choir concert. You have people with different voices, but they sing together to produce something that sounds harmonious. In an instrumental concert, you have all these different instruments playing different parts, and they all play together to sound harmonious. During the Concert of Europe, that period, say from 1815 till 1855 or so, that 40-year period, all the different monarchs, though they may have had different interests which would have led them to war in the past, instead, they now worked together against their common enemy, which was the people. And so that's what the Concert of Europe refers to, the working together, the coming together of Europe's monarchs in this sort of conservative or reactionary effort to suppress the masses. And that's why, or if you like, to restrain the masses. So that's why I used to call this unit the masses, unleashed and restrained. So that was the theme, that was the mentality behind the Congress of Vienna, this meeting of the representatives of the monarchs of Europe that took place after the defeat of Napoleon. So the leader of the Congress of Vienna was Klemens von Metternich, who was the foreign minister of the Austrian Empire. Now, most of the people at the Congress of Vienna were foreign ministers. That's what most monarchies referred to the person who's in charge of managing their relations with other countries. In the United States, we call that person the Secretary of State. But in most countries that were at least were at that time monarchies and today are no longer, but even were at one time monarchies, that person who manages relations with foreign countries is known as the foreign minister. So most of the people meeting at Vienna were foreign ministers, not actual monarchs. The foreign minister of Austria, and therefore the host of this Congress, since it was taking place in Vienna, the capital of the Austrian Empire, was Klemens von Metternich. And we see him standing here, and then you see him in this painting as well. Um, as the host, he essentially established the agenda, right? He crafted the ideas that would be the center of the discussion. It was really his ideas that were discussed during the Congress of Vienna. He set the agenda for what they would be talking about. And so, in the end, the policies that came out of the Congress of Vienna were in a way really his policies. He was the architect of that set of policies that were designed to make Europe safe for monarchy again. And that's a little play on Woodrow Wilson's idea. If you remember in World War I, when the United States entered, Woodrow Wilson, the president, had said that the United States mission was to make the world safe for democracy. Well, the mission of these guys at the Congress of Vienna was to make the world safe for, or at least to make Europe safe for monarchy. Among other things, this included restoring what would have been considered to be the legitimate monarchs to the thrones from which they had been removed by the French Revolution and Napoleon. Remember that the monarchs had a different concept of what made a government legitimate than the French revolutionaries or the other Enlightenment thinkers had. In Enlightenment philosophy, what makes a government legitimate is its adherence to the mission of protecting the people's natural rights. A government which protects people's natural rights is legitimate, one that doesn't isn't. That would be an Enlightenment perspective. Well, these were not enlightened thinkers. These were monarchs. They were much more conservative thinkers. And from their perspective, what made a government legitimate was that it had been that a certain family had been chosen by God to govern over that family's subjects, their people, their kingdom. Um, and that right, that divine right, had been passed down from generation to generation. And only those who possessed that right were the legitimate rulers of any country. So, one of the ideas about how to turn back the clock, maybe the most obvious idea about how to turn back the clock to the way things were prior to the French Revolution, was to restore the legitimate, as they saw it, monarchs to power, any place where they had been removed from power. So that included restoring the Bourbon family to the monarchy of France. So, for example, you remember that Louis the 18th, who was the sort of middle brother, there were three brothers in the Bourbon family. There was Louis the 16th, who was the oldest brother, who had been the king of France during the Revolution and along with his wife Marie Antoinette, had lost their heads. Then there was two younger brothers, a middle and then the youngest, who had fled from France and become emigres during the Revolution. It was the older of these two who was then restored to power as Louis the 18th by the victorious Allied powers who had defeated Napoleon. And he had been temporarily ousted when Napoleon made his 100 days return, but then he returned to power. And he governed France until, for about 10 years. He governed France till about 1825, 26. Um, so that would be an example. Of course, the restoration of the Spanish monarchy, Ferdinand VII, who had been removed from power unceremoniously by Napoleon Bonaparte and replaced by Napoleon's brother Joseph. He would be another example of a legitimate monarch who was restored to power by the agreement of the other monarchs. And really, anywhere in Europe where a monarch had been removed from power, that monarch was then restored. So that's an example of the kind of policy that was being developed by Klemens von Metternich and promoted amongst his fellow foreign ministers at the Congress of Vienna. Now, one of the things that the monarchs agreed to at Vienna, or at least their representatives, was an idea of Klemens von Metternich that France had to be, in a way, boxed in or contained, if you want to think of it as containment. There was a sense that France had the potential to cause future problems, since it had caused problems in the past. And there was a sense, too, that when Napoleon had exploded into the center of Europe, part of the reason why he had been able to do so was that there were no strong states bordering France to kind of restrain them and hold them in. And so one of the goals of Klemens von Metternich that he promoted at the Congress of Vienna was to surround France with strong entities. So, for example, the Netherlands here which had helped to defeat Napoleon. They were on the field at Waterloo. Received what had previously been known as the Austrian Netherlands. Right? So remember that this territory here, immediately north of France, to which Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette and the family had tried to flee and been caught right about here. Okay, the Austrian Netherlands was now given to the Netherlands as spoils of war, I guess you could say. It became territory of the Netherlands. And in doing so, they doubled the territory of the Netherlands, they doubled the resources, they doubled the population in the thought of strengthening the Netherlands, making it a stronger, more powerful state to help box France in to the north. To the south, the kingdoms of Sardinia, which is this island here, and Piedmont, which is this territory here. It's called Piedmont. This is the foot of the mountains, or the foothills. This is the foothills of the Alps. Remember that the Alps are this big mountain range right here, the highest, most forbidding mountain range in Europe. Well, the Piedmont is at the foot of the Alps. These were two separate kingdoms, and yet had the potential to be united through marriage. But the monarchs of Europe had to agree to that. They had to recognize that as a legitimate merger. And so they willingly did that because they believed that by adding Sardinia and Piedmont's resources together, it would create this stronger kingdom here, which was called Sardinia Piedmont or Piedmont Sardinia, to sort of box France in to the south. Also, by restoring northern Italy to Austria, Sardinia Piedmont then would be backed up by Austria to the south, here in northern Italy. The real struggle for creating a stronger entity to box in France then was not here, not here. That seemed to be done relatively simply. It was here. The problem was that Germany was broken up into all these small states. And to give you a sense of why that is, it goes back into ancient times because the the chiefs of the Germanic tribes who ruled this area here, and then the kings that eventually grew out of those tribes, the kingdoms that grew out of those tribes, originally they did not practice the way that really all other kingdoms of Europe did, what was called primogeniture. So in primogeniture, the kingdom is inherited by the oldest son. The entire kingdom is inherited by a king's oldest son. But that's not how the Germans practiced. The Germans practiced what was called partible inheritance, meaning that when a king died, his kingdom would then be divided amongst many sons. And so, as you can imagine, as generations after generations after generations passed, and kingdoms kept getting divided and divided and divided, you ended up with Germany fragmented into dozens, if not hundreds, of tiny kingdoms. And some of those had gradually, conglomerated into larger ones, the most notable one being Prussia. But still, even after Napoleon's defeat, most of those kingdoms were these tiny little kingdoms, many of which were no larger than Franklin County. So what did you do with that? What were the monarchs of Europe to do with this? If they wanted to have a strong entity here to box France into the East, did you create a German state? How do you do that? How would you force all these little German kings to give up their little kingdoms to forge a single German state to box France in here? And then who would rule it? Would it be led by Prussia, which was, this sort of up and coming German kingdom? Or would it be ruled by the Habsburgs of Austria, who were a German family who ruled over an empire that was mostly not German? There were all sorts of complications with creating a German state. And at any rate, some of the monarchs and foreign ministers were fearful of what would happen if you established this extremely powerful German state right in the center of Europe. And honestly, the history of the 20th century sort of justifies their concerns in doing that. Well, anyway, they settled on the creation of a confederation, which they called a German confederation. And the German confederation was simply a tight alliance of German states. They retained their independence, but they were tightly aligned with each other under the joint leadership of Prussia and Austria. So this confederation would have a sort of a confederation parliament, and that parliament was jointly chaired, jointly led by Prussia and Austria. So for the moment, the prospect of a German state was kicked into the future. And all of this was really designed um, to to reflect Metternich's own concerns about France as a potential source of future instability. It was he who had said, "When Paris sneezes, all of Europe catches a cold." Democracy is the disease which must be cured, the volcano which must be extinguished, the gangrene which must be burned out with a hot iron, the hydra with jaws open to swallow up the social order. Whew. Well, we see how they viewed democracy, and or at least how Klemens von Metternich viewed democracy. And France had been the fountainhead of democracy, at least for the moment, on the continent of Europe. And don't get me wrong, Britain had been a democracy of sorts by that time for really quite some time. But Britain was Britain. They sit there on their island. Sometimes they get involved with the continent, sometimes they don't. Britain was kind of seen to be an outlier. But France had given birth to Europe's first modern popular democracy. And it had then caused problems all over Europe, and Metternich and his buddies were determined not to allow that to happen again. And so they created these entities to sort of border France to the north, to the south, to the east, and to box France in. So that if anything erupted in France again, it would have a harder time spreading out into the rest of Europe. So one step was to box in France. But what if that didn't work? What if boxing France in alone didn't do the trick and there were future revolts favoring democracy? What if popular revolts broke out again in Europe? So Metternich's next plan then was to create an alliance. This alliance would act, I like to say to the ninth graders, as a sort of a fire department whose job it was, in the event that a revolt broke out anywhere in Europe, to go in and crush it before it could develop into a full-blown revolution. In the eyes of people like Metternich, the European monarchs had had the opportunity to do this with the French Revolution if they had done it early on, but they didn't. They kept waiting, on Louis XVI to successfully suppress what was going on in his own country. And by the time they concluded that Louis XVI couldn't do that, um, or had failed to do that, it was too late. The revolt was now a revolution, and at that point, it had a momentum of its own and proved to be very difficult to stop. It didn't stop until, in a way, until after Napoleon was finally defeated at Waterloo. So regrets over that, regrets over the fact that they had not crushed the revolution in its infancy in France, led to this decision to create an alliance to act as a sort of a fire department, so that when a fire breaks out anywhere in Europe, they can rush to the scene and put it out before it begins to burn out of control. That's why I call it a fire department. And this was known as the Holy Alliance. Originally, it was an alliance of Prussia, Russia, Austria, and Great Britain. Um, the British almost immediately regretted agreeing to this. And the reason why is that Britain is an island. And being on an island gave the British the opportunity to pick and choose where and when they wanted to get involved in the continent of Europe, a condition that the British referred to as splendid isolation. Because of that, the British, generally speaking, did not want themselves to be tied down with any kind of permanent alliances on the continent of Europe. And so they almost immediately regretted, and eventually they backed out of this so-called Holy Alliance. In time, France actually joined, but for the longest period, the Holy Alliance really was this sort of triumvirate of the three emperors. The emperor, if you prefer, the king of Prussia, the emperor of Austria, and the Tsar or emperor of Russia. So Prussia, Russia, Austria, the three great conservative or even reactionary powers on the continent of Europe. And they promised each other and sort of promised, or if you prefer, threatened the rest of Europe, saying, if a revolt breaks out anywhere, we will move in and crush it so that it will not have the opportunity to grow out of control. And this played out in future years, really within the next 10 years, as revolts favoring a constitutionalist type government or a liberal government in Naples, which is in southern Italy, was then crushed by Austria. And in 1830, you have a revolt in Poland that was crushed by the Russians. And you'll see as we go on and through this unit, you'll see other instances where the Holy Alliance moves in and kind of does its thing. So the Holy Alliance was a fire department, in a way. Um, but the more Klemens von Metternich thought about it, after leaving the Congress of Vienna, after the Congress had ended, the more concerned he became about preventing revolts. And when you think about it, fire prevention really is better than firefighting. If you can prevent fires, that is a better thing. And so Metternich began to think after the Congress of Vienna, well, what can you do to prevent revolts from breaking out in the first place? So he believed that the beginning of revolts were radical ideas, and he encouraged other monarchs to do everything that they could to suppress the movement among their people of radical ideas and the sharing of radical ideas. What kind of radical ideas are we talking about? Well, one would be liberalism. Liberalism was the idea that government has a responsibility to protect the natural rights of its people, and therefore government's power ought to be limited, uh, ideally by a written constitution. That was the liberal idea of the 19th century. That's what liberalism meant, that government is made legitimate by its protection of the people's natural rights, and that therefore it should have limited and not absolute power, and that its power should be limited in a written constitution. That would have been considered a radical idea. Today we don't consider it a radical idea, but it would have been considered a radical idea by Metternich and the monarchs. And so that was the kind of radical idea that should be suppressed. Nationalism was another one. The idea that each nation ought to govern itself and not be ruled by outsiders. So, for example, those Poles who rebelled in 1830 did not want to be ruled by Russia. They were part of the Russian Empire. Poles wanted to be ruled by Poles, not by Russians. You'll learn later on about Hungarians or Magyars who wanted to be ruled by themselves and not be ruled by the Habsburg family, who ruled the Austrian Empire. We'll hear about Irish who want to be self-governing and not be ruled by the British. So again, to us, that's not a radical idea. But in those days, in the eyes of guys like Metternich and the monarchs, it was a radical idea that needed to be suppressed. And so Metternich encouraged the monarchs all across Europe that they needed to act to suppress these kinds of ideas. It was hard because these ideas had spread across Europe as a result of Napoleon. The liberal idea Napoleon had brought with him. I mean, the liberal idea is really an evolution of the Enlightenment, right? Napoleon had brought these Enlightenment or liberal ideas with him wherever he went and spread them to all these countries when he forced them to adopt his code of laws. So the liberal seed had been spread all across Europe, by Napoleon. Nationalism was more of a reaction against Napoleon and his universalizing impulse, but that seed too had been planted, admittedly in reaction against Napoleon, but nevertheless planted. It was going to be difficult to root those out. But Metternich was determined that public opinion must be brought under control, that public opinion and the spread of radical ideas through the public was the greatest danger to monarchs, and the greatest danger of causing revolts. Metternich said, "Public opinion is the most powerful of all means. Like religion, it penetrates the most hidden recesses where administrative measures have no influence. To neglect public opinion is as dangerous as to neglect moral principles, and if the latter will rise up even when they have almost been stifled, it is not so with opinion. Opinion requires peculiar cultivation, a continued and sustained perseverance. Posterity will hardly believe that we have regarded silence as an efficacious weapon to oppose the clamors of our opponents, and in a century of words, who can blame us if we will not allow the public to be supplied with lies about us?" And that's how he viewed radical ideas, lies about the proper way of governing. And so, this idea that public opinion must be carefully tended to, cultivated, as he says, to make sure that the right ideas are surviving and the wrong ideas are being choked out. That was, he felt, essential to the stability of Europe and to the security of the monarchs. And so in 1819, he encouraged the rulers of Prussia and Austria to issue jointly a series of decrees, and they did so. And these were known as the Carlsbad decrees. They circulated these decrees among the German states, the states of the German Confederation. But eventually, these decrees became influential throughout Europe. In other words, other European monarchs took these decrees as a model, and Metternich certainly encouraged them to, as a model for their own policies for controlling public opinion and suppressing radical ideas. So the Carlsbad decrees insisted that all of the German states, and again, this was influential elsewhere, that all of the German states adopt systematic censorship. So all daily publications, that would be newspapers, and pamphlets, political pamphlets, were therefore subject to what is called prior restraint. Prior restraint is a more formal term for censorship. And what that means is that before any item could be published, that is, run through the printing press, before a printer could make multiple copies of any printed material, that material had to be submitted to a government agent, a censor, okay, and had to be approved by that censor before it could be published. So that's why it's called prior restraint. The government could say, no, you're not allowed to print that. So the concept of censorship is that the content had to be approved by the government prior to it being published. So that was one of the things that they did to try to stop the spread of these so-called radical ideas through the press. The Carlsbad decrees also sought to stifle academic freedom, that is, the freedom that exists in schools, colleges, and universities, the freedom to talk about ideas sort of openly and critique ideas in a way that is open-minded, I guess you could say. So, for example, teachers and professors who, who, and this is a quotation from the actual Carlsbad decrees, uh, who had demonstrated abuse of their legitimate influence over youthful minds. So apparently, There was an agreement that teachers and professors had legitimate influence over useful minds, but those who abused that legitimate influence by introducing youthful minds to radical ideas could be disciplined by being removed from their positions. So teachers or professors who introduce their students to radical ideas must be dismissed. Austria, and then followed by other states, also established what was called an extraordinary commission of investigation. Better, simpler terminology, more familiar terminology is a secret police. Secret police are like spies, except instead of spying on other countries, they spy on your own people, who, as I said at the beginning, were increasingly regarded as the most dangerous enemy to monarchs. So secret police were police who didn't wear uniforms. They were there to spy on their own people because there were secret societies developing in Europe, and they had to be secret because of all this. Liberal societies, national societies, and the idea of a secret police was to try to find out who these societies were, who their members were, where they meet, when they meet, try to join these societies and learn as much as possible about them, gather up all the information you need, and then ultimately arrest them, right? Arrest their members, silence them, destroy the societies, to root out and suppress revolutionary plots and demagogical associations, as the Carlsbad Decrees said. So, as these ideas and these policies spread across Europe, it became increasingly clear that the response of the monarchs of Europe then to the emergence, the appearance on the scene of the masses as a political force was a response rooted in fear, rooted in terror, really, of the masses. And the response was to try their very best to suppress or restrain the masses and prevent them from wielding political influence. So that's setting the table for really the rest of the 19th century in a lot of ways. A lot of the popular movements of the 19th century, which did in fact result in revolts, and in some cases successful revolutions, despite all of this, a lot of them were a pushing back against this kind of effort to restrain, to put the genie back in the box and keep him there. Um, so that the public, the people, the masses could never wield the kind of political influence that they had done during the French Revolution. So really, a lot of the rest of this unit is the story of the people fighting back against this. And sometimes they succeed and sometimes they fail. So that's where we'll go in future lessons. And I look forward to teaching you those lessons. So until then, take care of yourselves, be healthy, and be safe. Goodbye, everyone.